When I was around 11 years old or so, my family was invited out to my second cousin's wedding down in Texas. She was marrying the nephew of an extremely high-ranking employee of a massive oil company. Just to be careful, and for the sake of everybody's privacy, I won't name which one. Also, I'm not sure how much I can disclose without potentially getting into legal trouble. But, basically, the entire family is very, very wealthy. I'm talking like the 1% kind of wealthy. While my cousin didn't come from a particularly rich background herself, she was incredibly smart, was the valedictorian of her class, and had gotten a scholarship to a prestigious university, where she met her to-be husband. Their wedding was going to be absolutely massive, and as far as I knew, had no budget. The invitation to the ceremony even told us to expect the time of our lives and to skip Disneyland this year. The actual wedding ceremony would only take place on one day, but the festivities were over the course of a week, and we were told to treat it no different than a vacation. My immediate family was all the way up in Pennsylvania, and we were provided with the money from the groom's family to buy top-quality suits and dresses for the event, and were even given free first-class tickets for our flight to Texas. It was a nice gesture, but it was pocket change for them, really, and I'm sure they wanted everybody to look as good as possible. Regardless, living a mundane suburban middle-class life family made my family excited for the occasion. It would be quite the change of pace from what we were used to. We arrived just a few days before the wedding, so we could get settled in. My immediate family was provided with our own cottage to stay in, as were all of the other guests. The land in which the house was sited on was several hundred acres, large, filled with forestry. It even included a secluded little village with charming shops and restaurants. To top it all off, all of this was bordered by a massive lake. I spent most of my first day there, walking around or being hauled around in golf carts with my family. I reunited with the relatives that I hadn't seen in a while, and met my to-be in-laws. Most of them were polite enough, but our extremely stark differences in class did make things feel awkward. That evening during dinner, I was invited by a member of the groom's family to have a kids' sleepover on one of the yachts the following evening. My parents were a bit hesitant to let me go, but ultimately agreed when our in-laws reassured them that they would all be well supervised, and the boat was equipped with many security cameras. So, if one of the kids went missing, it'd be pretty easy to track down where they went. I was mostly excited to have the opportunity to actually hang out with other kids my age. The next morning after breakfast, I was boarding the boat, as they planned to have us go fishing that afternoon. It was absolutely massive. I swore it was nearly as long as a football field. We were told that if we really wanted to, we could each have our own bedroom, and I'd say there were about 30 of us on board. After they made sure everybody was on the boat, we waved off to our parents and relatives as it began to churn forward. I remember holding onto the railings and watched the water below. After about 15 minutes, we had arrived at the spot that we would be fishing in. We were taken to an area of the boat that was solely dedicated to fishing, and were provided with our fishing rods and bait. We had fun and caught a lot of things. We kept the fish in a cooler, so the cooking staff that were brought along with us could prepare dinner. I spent a lot of the day exploring the boat. I mean, it had everything. It had its own arcade, bowling alley, aquarium, pretty much anything cool and fun you can think of. We were given fancy snacks and candy I'd never even heard of before. And when it was time for dinner, we had an all-you-can-eat buffet with such a wide array of foods that I didn't even know where to begin. I was absolutely stuffed by the end of the hour. Most of the kids decided to wind down in the yacht's movie theater, so I tagged along. I actually found the rich kids to be a bit annoying and stuck up, but I was having a good time with my cousins, and that was all that mattered. I knew it would be an occasion we'd be talking at family reunions for years, perhaps even decades to come, and I wanted to make the most out of it. we put on our first movie, Jaws. The age range of kids was about 8 to 13, and the adults on the boat promised to not tell our parents that we viewed the film. And that they were cool. After a couple of hours, everybody seemed to settle down to sleep. I nodded off, but awoke to the feeling of a bang, followed by a harsh rocking of the boat. Not surprisingly, this tore the other kids out of their sleep too. They began to ask what was going on, and the younger ones cried about how it was Jaws. After a couple of minutes, it happened again, perhaps even more forceful this time. Some kids were screaming at this point, and I was trying to figure out what in the lake could even be big enough to make the yacht rock with such a force. The lights flicked on, and I squinted as my eyes adjusted to the brightness. One of the adults was here by now, and was urging us to calm down. Some kids left the room, and I was curious to see what was going on. So I went along with them. We were yelled at to stay in the room, but didn't listen. I looked over the railing and saw splashing from beside the boat, and then heard a loud echoing groan, like that of a whale's. Some speculated it was a whale, but others reminded them that whales don't live in fresh water. The boat was still slightly rocking from the force of whatever was moving around it, and I had to hold onto the railing just to keep my balance. In the light that the yacht provided, I swore I can make out what looked to be part of a massive fin peek out from above the water before disappearing back underneath. After a couple of minutes and talking among the other kids, I noticed the silhouette of a serpent far in the distance, with the humps of its body sticking out from the lake in a parabola-like manner. Its head looked to be similar to what you'd expect to see on a lizard. The serpent went back under the surface, and all was quiet. We stayed up for about an hour or so after, waiting for its return, but it never came back. We finally went to bed, all of us exhausted the following morning. We were still pretty excited by the event though, and it was all we talked about. Some kids even called and texted their parents about it. I didn't have a cell phone at the time, but I was anxious to tell my parents. By the time we returned to the docks, it was nearly time for lunch, and that's when I caught up with my family and told them what had happened. They seemed mostly confused, but glad I was okay. Later on in the evening, I found out the groom's family had called out a crew to inspect the yacht to make sure it wasn't damaged. They were told that the underbelly had quite a few hefty dents, and that they were lucky that a hole wasn't pierced. There was some drama among the family, mostly on them debating whether or not the incident was some crude assassination attempt, or possibly a terrorist attack. I heard staff were fired for not reporting the incident right away, or returning the boat back to the docks that night. It was a mess. There was already a lot of security at that wedding, and it only doubled down. Now, I'm not entirely sure what happened next, but word had gotten out the next day that there was a wreckage of a small fishing boat and was found dispersed throughout the lake. From what was left of it, the authorities can make out that this belonged to a man who had been missing since the night we were out on the water. His body was nowhere to be found. It was quickly believed that there was some sort of bombs or other artillery in the water, but us kids who had been there that night knew differently. Most of us pieced together that the monster must have destroyed the man's boat before he was eaten. When we tried to relay the theory to the older folks, we weren't met with a lot of positive reception. I received a few scoldings about needing to respect the dead and consider how his family must feel, and that I needed to take the threat of a terrorist attack more seriously, as only a handful of years have passed since 9/11. At the same time, all of the guests were encouraged to keep as quiet as possible, as to not attract the attention of media, and potentially ruining the wedding. Despite all of this, the wedding proceeded as normal and went smoothly. Towards the end, the trip was as fun and eventful as it was. When I was finally back home, I had the chance to tell my friends about it, and one of my friends said that his grandpa saw the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland before he immigrated to the U.S., and hypothesized that it was a species of dinosaur that never actually went extinct, as the water helped create a protective barrier between them and the meteor that struck the Earth. Whatever the case, I know what I saw, and I still stand by it after all of these years. As far as I'm aware, the man's body was never discovered, and he still remains missing to this day. I don't exactly spend a lot of time too invested in trying to find more evidence, and I'm not exactly a Nessie fanatic. Still, I figured I might as well get my story out there. It'd be nice to hear if anybody else had a similar experience down here in Texas.